Hi there. Welcome back to our 3D Heals 2020 speaker interview series. All of our speakers have amazing stories to tell and are great resources for anyone who wants to innovate in healthcare 3D printing and bioprinting. And the intention behind these interviews is to decrease the distance between our speakers and the audience before 3D Heals 2020. And you can think of them as icebreakers for you by us. Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Chaw Sing Ho from Singapore NAMIC. NAMIC is also known as National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Cluster. He is the co-founder and managing director of NAMIC, and we're also fortunate to have him as a speaker for 3D Heals 2020 Global Updates panel. Good to see you, Dr. Ho.
Thanks, Jenny. Happy to be here.
So my understanding is that NAMIC is very much similar in many ways, but not exactly identical to American Makes, which we also are fortunate to have as a panel speaker. Do you mind of just introduce us what NAMIC does?
Mm-hmm. So we are well, in some ways we're like a facilitator, and we are basically the branch office. Funded out from the Prime Minister's office, which is the National Research Foundation. The mission for us is really to drive value creation and capture by industrializing the 3D printing technology for all our key manufacturing and engineering sectors. So we do this through a couple of ways. One is, of course, I mentioned that we facilitate. So through, we identify project pipelines with industry partners and essentially find relevant research performers that could perform the projects. And at the same time, for any industry adoption to happen, you need to do not just projects, but you also need to make sure that the industry is able to take it on their own at some point in time. So we essentially work very closely with the Economic Development Board of Singapore to identify companies that are in this space of Industry 4.0 or the next generation of industrialization technology, and to create an ecosystem where you have both supply side of the technology, as well as to find some of the early adopters and which are adopting these technologies, and progress them quickly through the initial learning curve. So we do a lot of work in terms of trying to seed thought leadership, and of course bring in external thought leaders to help our local community to understand what this technology is really all about and what it can really do. And of course, in most cases, the projects that we curate is really also about finding the solutions using this technology, as opposed to just pure technology play.
It sounds like you play many roles from, I guess, incubator to accelerator to almost a connection to the government funding and economic policies. So many, many different roles. But your background is electrical engineering.
Yes.
And how does that make a connection transition from, engineering to now become this really exciting initiative? What is that journey, the story behind it?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think all of us started with some discipline, I would say. And yes, I did start my career. In fact, I spent 10 years in the semiconductor foundry industry. And actually, to me, that was a very good foundation to, in some ways, prepare me for what I actually wanted to do. Actually, I consider myself more of as an engineer. And I think this is something that you sort of gradually evolved. It's not like I thought of myself as someone who could cross over to other disciplines. I think the industry exposure that I had in my first 16 years of my career really helped me because it basically allowed me to look at things in different perspective. Right? So ultimately, engineers we are problem solvers. So you know, the technology is just an enabler. So you basically pick it up as you go along. Mm-hmm. And how I even came into this role was, in some ways, was a bit by accident. I would say, as my last role in HP, I would say give me a lot of the exposure, you know, to look at both, not just the engineering aspect, but also the business aspects. And I realized that the passion I have, you know, that I want to embark on in my next stage of my career is really to help society at large. It might sound a bit cliche, but it's to some extent quite true. I mean, you spend 16 years in the private sector. A lot of the focus is on yourself, on your own success. But at some point, I realized that's not what really, you know, what I really like to do. And I just feel that it's very important for me to contribute what I know mm-hmm. to the society at large.
Yeah, I mean, I visited Singapore twice, thanks to your invitation. And, you know, my impression is Singapore is really in a position to be the powerhouse of the next science and technology of Asia. So it's also funny that you said accidental. I mean, I did a couple of interviews with the other Sweetie Hills 2020 speakers, and many people mentioned the word accidental. And I would say, you know, me personally, probably is also very accidental, but I feel fortunate that I am on this journey, especially with individuals like you. This is a very exciting and fun accidental journey that we've been on for many years, actually. In your written interview that you did with us a while back, you mentioned that there are a lot of challenges. And I believe those challenges are not, you know, there's no magic bullet to solve, which is how to, you know, create these collaborations between, you know, research to startups to bigger corporations so that they can work together, and plus the government, which you also are connected to. Any thoughts on solutions or hopes in that arena?
Yeah, I guess the well, the challenges right now that Singapore is facing, I would say it's not really unique, but at the same time, it's also quite unique in a certain way because we're a very small country and we don't have much resources, and the country is still very young. If you compare us to some of the more, you know, developed countries like the U.S. And of course, you know, European countries as well. I think it is a, you know, a very clear, at least in my mind, it's very clear that, you know, Singapore, for us to be successful the next 50 years, we have to undo some of the things that we are doing right now. And not so much to reinvent, but really to position ourselves correctly. So whatever has worked in the last 50 years is maybe it's still going to be okay if we continue on this route, but it's not going to sustain us, you know, in perpetuity. So as a result of that, in some ways, we're going through this, you know, cycle of change, which is extremely painful, actually. In some ways, I'm fortunate that I'm in this role because, you know, I'm actually in some way buffeted by the changes that's sweeping across all the industries today. You look at the example like the manufacturing sector in Singapore. We've been very successful in the last 30, 40 years attracting multinationals to set up satellite manufacturing hubs. And we've been very good at doing, you know, like I would say, following in some ways. We're very fast followers. We apply very well. But in terms of actual innovation and, you know, creating new technology and new business models, that's not really, you know, traditionally what Singapore is known for. Mm-hmm. Yes, to some extent, you look at the metrics that we sometimes measure ourselves against the world. It does look like Singapore is always among the top. As an example, you look at innovation efficiency, right? Innovation efficiency to me is basically how much private R&D is there versus the public R&D dollars that the government has pumped in. And that number actually is not good. Okay, so we are investing a lot of the taxpayers' money, but we're not, in some ways, able to turn this into a more sustainable R&D investments from the private community. And this is a big cause of concern of course, from the government perspective, because ultimately, for you to become one of the most innovative economies in the world, in order to be relevant in this next 50 years, you have to be innovative. So these are some of the things that we are facing as a challenge. Of course, there are many others. The social part of it, the disparity in incomes. I think this is very common as well, not just other parts of the world, but in Singapore as well. So for me, I think the value add that we think we can bring, to not to address every problem, but in terms of at least positioning our manufacturing sector, which I feel is very important for us to keep, irrespective of the cost level that we, in terms of competitiveness wise, we're not competitive enough, just based on cost. So in order to differentiate, you have to basically start innovating, and to do that, you got to create infrastructure which allows people to do the knowledge building, either through research, and more importantly, is also to translate these research into real economic value add products and solutions. And that's something that I would consider. We are stepping through this journey. It's not I don't think we're there yet. I would say we are somewhere between. And coming from the private sector, I would say to a certain level, we were able to influence some segments of the government to think differently about how we used to be, doing public R&D, as opposed to actually using R&D as a means to finance, just create economic value add. So that's I would say the gist of what the underlying mission that is in some ways underpins our approach in technology translation.
Now, in addition to innovation within Singapore, what is the hope or current existing connection to the world? Is Singapore or NAMIC providing extra resources for external talents to acquire them, to encourage companies to perhaps move to Singapore to continue to develop? I mean, do you guys have some kind of program for that?
Yeah, I think I would say Singapore as a whole has always been, very open to talents, overseas talents, and I don't think that will change. I think maybe if you read some of the news reports recently, there is some level of concern from the electorate on the number of immigrants that we have in Singapore. But I think to be very clear here is that we're not discriminating against anyone. It's just that for us to be to be innovative, we want to still continue to be relevant. We need to attract the best people, foreign talent. So I think moving away from the sort of the relatively low cost wage earners and moving more towards people who can create innovate on product solutions, who has generally a much higher qualifications in terms of the postgraduate education and things like that. And for NAMIC itself, we are constantly on the lookout, to be very frank, for companies. We don't just look for individuals, because we think companies can jumpstart this journey with us. I mean, I spent actually, interestingly, I wasn't expecting this when I took on this role, but I do spend quite a bit of time traveling to engage with some of our global colleagues in the AM space, just to understand what's happening. And then in most cases, we actually are on the lookout for very, very promising startups, which are hungry to establish themselves in Asia. And our approach is to try to bring these companies in at a very early stage, as opposed to when they're really established, and grow with them together. So we help them through, whether it's funding or the network that we have, And then I think that's the long term, right? So once you're able to go through that process and they are anchored here, the hope is that they wouldn't just, after 15 years, once the tax incentives runs out, they will just pack their bags and go off to some other cheaper countries and offer them the same.
So Structo 3D will be one good example out of NAMIC, would it? As a started with a seed and now has grown much.
Yeah, I think I don't claim credit for, to be frank, for any startups that are doing well. But I would say, like you mentioned, Structo. Structo is a very interesting company because they, in some ways, literally grew together with us. I mean, they started maybe slightly earlier than when we started back in October 2015. And the CEO, Hoop, is an NUS grad. I was an NUS grad. So we hit off very well, even though we are both, different nationalities. We literally saw them through the early struggles. And in some ways, I would say, I was very glad that I could actually help them, maybe not through the conventional schemes that we have through NAMIC, because because they're a foreign-owned sort of company, even though it's incorporated in Singapore. So in some ways, they couldn't qualify for some of the early incentives. But we were able to bring the government agencies like Enterprise Singapore, which used to be called Spring, to see the value of these companies that are started by foreigners, but they actually have a very strong desire, right, to be in Singapore. So they actually, there's credit actually to the government agencies that they're very flexible. Even though you go through the website, it looks like, you do not fulfill all the checklists, but they are willing to engage and eventually even offer very concrete support to these companies. So, and also to Structo's credit, they have executed very well in the last few years.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very impressed when I see what they're doing. And also in general, the dental 3D printing space, I think it's going to be the first to hit a home run in our sector. No, I know you shared with us some of your ambition and vision for the future of NAMIC, but I also know that, Singapore is in the middle of a pandemic like every other country. And I know that you suddenly are now having so many more new tasks against the pandemic. You have to take on some different roles. You want to share with us how you're dealing with this new role?
Yeah, it's. I think this is happening everywhere around the world, and in some ways we are, very, very excited that, in some ways this was a crisis, and not to say profit on any crisis, but we realize the work that all of us are doing, including yourself, with 3D printing technology. This is the perfect fit for a situation where you see disruption in traditional supply chain models. Overnight, I think, Singapore being a small country, as I said, we don't produce a lot of stuff in Singapore. We import most of our stuff. I mean, food, goods, whatever, right? Consumers and whatnot. But suddenly you have this situation where you're short of, very critical supplies, right? Especially for us to be able to overcome this pandemic, we need to do mass testing, right? But the problem is we don't have the supplies to do mass testing. So I would say in the last 2 months or so, and it started also with the lockdown that we're still in today, we've started several work streams in basically using 3D printing technology to create on-demand manufacturing to address some of the shortage that our medical community is facing. It's not just the nasopharyngeal swabs or ventilated components. We have face shield parts, whether it's the spec frames or certain parts of the shields itself. What we are seeing is that interestingly, the 3D printing companies in Singapore is doing well. And I think I was talking to Printer Press just this week, and they shared the same thing with me. They show me a very interesting chart that showed their revenue shooting up, in the last few months, which I think in some ways is great for them, and I'm very happy always to see startups doing well. But it also shows that I think sometimes with crisis there is an opportunity that creates. And I think this is really the time for us to step up. And fortunately, I think I would say the community is really also, banding together. I don't see the traditional companies able to do what the global 3D community has done. I mean, I've been in some ways inundated with requests from overseas organizations offering their designs, saying how we can collaborate together. I think this is something that is in some ways very unique, because AM itself is a digital technology, and I think people kind of lose that in some ways, just thinking that it's 3D printing, right? But to me, it's about a technology that can be used in the future smart digital world. You don't no longer have to be bounded by the traditional ways of centralizing manufacturing, distributing the goods and all that. But you can actually do it anywhere, and you can do it on demand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in a way, pandemic is forcing us to think outside of the box in every single step that we do in our daily life, in our work. It's a bit of it is a crisis that basically force us to think differently. Most people, daily life, you and I go to work, but now is like a oddball throwing at you, and then you just have to catch it and go with it. Go with the punch. So, but thank you very much for sharing with us, and thanks for this interview. And I very much look forward to your presentation in a couple weeks, June 3D Heals 2020. Thank you, Dr. Ho.
Thank you, Jenny.